We'll meet at 2 p.m. and sit until 6 p.m. The order of business, Mr. Speaker, for tomorrow, seeing as how it's the day of the introduction of the budget, when the House comes in at 2 o'clock, we'll immediately go into the delivery of the budget. At the conclusion of the budget, the finance critic from the official opposition will speak for whatever time, normally about 15 minutes or so, and then adjourn the debate. And at that time, we will then go into the daily routine, question period, and government business. And the government business tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, it will be a very short period of time, so perhaps we'll just resume the throne debate until such time as it's time to rise. And then on Friday, Mr. Speaker, we'll be meeting, as I said before, at 12 noon and sitting until 2. And the order of business will be a very abbreviated, under the daily routine, there will be a very abbreviated number of items, if we put it that way. And then we'll move into the continuation of the reply from the official opposition finance minister, then the one from the third party, and at the conclusion of that, Mr. Speaker, we'll go home. So we should be out of here by around about 1:30, I would imagine, or earlier on Friday for those who wish to depart the city. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motion is the House adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Countermanded nay. Motion is carried. The House adjourned to 2 p.m. tomorrow. We've now reached the moment of interruption to call upon the honourable member for Colchester-Muscatawbit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, be it resolved that members of the House recognize the federal gun registry for what it is, an incredible waste of Canadian taxpayers' dollars for an ineffective, inefficient method of curbing violent crime. My colleague to the left is asking me how much. It's anybody's guess. The Federal Auditor General, Sheila Fraser, says it's going to cost at least $1 billion. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that the federal gun registry clearly illustrates what's wrong with the federal Liberals in Ottawa. The $1 billion boondoggle, Mr. Speaker, the $1 billion boondoggle has and continues to be misguided, mismanaged, miscalculated, misleading, a misfeasance, and certainly misspent, Mr. Speaker. Former Justice Minister, Mr. Speaker, Alan Rock, Anne McClellan, Mr. Speaker, Cauchon, Wayne Easter from Easter Island, or PEI, whatever it's called, Prime Minister Chrétien, and Paul Martin, the former Finance Minister, should all be ashamed of themselves. Every single one of them, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, and last week I was congratulating and commending the three parties in Ottawa that had the courage, Mr. Speaker, the courage, the intestinal fortitude to vote against another $59 million to add to already a $1 billion boondoggle. And those three parties were the federal PCs, the Canadian Alliance, and the NDP. And one has to wonder. Now, having said, now I know the NDP has a new leader, but having said that, one has to wonder about the NDP's newfound interest and now, in certain areas, their newfound support for those that are against the Federal Firearms Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, it should be noted, and a number of concerns regarding the Firearms Act have been clearly articulated in provincial legislatures across this province, and sometimes the Liberal caucus, the Liberal caucus, sometimes, Mr. Speaker, they will say, well, why does the Tories speak about, the provincial Tories speak about the Federal Firearms Act? Well, the fact of the matter is all you have to do is look opposite to find out why we're speaking against it. All you have to do is look across the way to find out. Mr. Speaker, there's a muzzle order, there's a gag order, or something is happening. They can't be hearing well, Mr. Speaker, because they're not standing up for rural Nova Scotia. That's why the Tories are speaking up, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, a professor, Mr. Speaker, Dr. Ted Morton, in the summer of 2002, Dr. Ted Morton of the University of Calgary, he's a professor of political science. He prepared a paper entitled how the Firearms Act, Bill C-68, violates our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Dr. Morton's paper goes on to explain that the right to security of person has been violated by this very, very act. And he goes on at great detail as to how one's right to security of person has been violated. And Mr. Speaker, the other day I had an opportunity during my response to the throne speech to indicate that Dr. Morton had concerns that our right to bear arms has been violated by the federal firearms registration. Yes. Now, Mr. Speaker, a member opposite, unofficially, so to speak, asked, the right to bear arms? You mean we as Canadians have a right to bear arms and we're afraid to stand up and say that we have that right? Well, Mr. Speaker, I would like to quote, and I can table this document that was prepared by Dr. Morton from the University of Calgary. The right to bear arms has existed in English common law for the last 300 years and is important and imported into Canadian law by the preamble of the BNA Act 1867, and Section 26 of the Charter of Rights declares that traditional rights not listed in the Charter continue to have force and effect in Canada. The first explicit recognition of the right to bear arms in British Canadian law occurs in the 1689 Bill of Rights. It is reaffirmed by the celebrated Blackstone in his commentaries as one of the 5 most important rights of British subjects. And Mr. Speaker, I find it reprehensible that so many of our rights and freedoms, the right to the freedom of expression, according to Dr. Morton, has been violated. Section 2B of the Charter protects the freedom of expression. The courts have interpreted this to protect not just written or spoken words, but also expressive activity such as marching and protest rallies, Mr. Speaker. And Lord knows there's lots of protests for and against different issues, especially with the events that are happening today in the world. So, this is a professor, a highly respected professor, I might add, Mr. Speaker, that has big, major concerns about the Federal Firearms Act. And I am so pleased that the Justice Minister and Attorney General of this province is going to travel to Ottawa, I believe it's next Monday, along with a couple of colleagues, my colleague from the Eastern Shore, and you, Mr. Speaker, I believe, Cumberland South MLA, are going to present a case again stating the position of the Nova Scotia government, the progressive conservative government. We are, and I commend, and I'm so pleased to be part of a government and a team and surrounded by colleagues that feel strongly about an issue that violates the rights of rural Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. And there are people, yes, all Nova Scotians have concerns about this piece of legislation. But we have the courage to stand up and say what we believe, Mr. Speaker. Now, I want to quickly clear up a misconception, Mr. Speaker, if you will. I've had an opportunity, along with some of my colleagues, to speak to the Nova Scotia Firearms Office, and some people have concerns, especially those that are advocating non-compliance, that we should somehow shut down the Nova Scotia Firearms Office. Well, I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I have referred many of my constituents. Just 2 weeks ago, a lady from the Middle Stewiacke area called me and said, look, I got 3 firearms, long rifles. I can't find a serial number on those rifles. I referred her to Mr. Martin Kramers and his staff, and you know what? I was so pleased that the Nova Scotia Firearms Office, and not some cold-hearted bureaucrat from Ottawa, was on the other end of the telephone answering and telling the lady how she could go about registering her firearms. So don't tell me, people that are advocating non-compliance, that we should somehow pull out and bring in the feds and say, it's your baby, you do what you want with it. I don't think anybody in Nova Scotia wants the federal government to come in here and mess it up any more than they already have. It's a bad law, and it should be abolished. It should be squashed, especially the registration of long rifles, Mr. Speaker. Incidentally, I think handguns have had to been registered, well, it seems like forever, certainly before my time, and 90% of crimes that are committed with a firearm committed with a handgun. So does registration work? No, clearly it doesn't, Mr. Speaker. I know you know that as a former policeman, and I know you've taken a strong stand in Cumberland South in your own riding on behalf of your constituents. I know my colleague from the Eastern Shore has. Yes, and the Speaker does deserve a round of applause because he has been proactive, and he's going to Ottawa. He is going to Ottawa But what a shell game the federal government is playing. Well, look, we had an injustice. Let's move it over to the Office of the Solicitor General, you know. And they've changed finance ministers like we change our socks, Mr. Speaker, or pardon me, justice ministers and solicitor generals and so on it goes. And it's really a shame that nobody up there is listening. But I have to say right here and now that the federal Progressive Conservatives, and there is a leadership contest taking place now, but all the candidates, to my knowledge, the 7 that are in that race, have stated emphatically that they are for the revocation of this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. And I'm telling you, based on the national demographics politically in this country, that the federal Progressive Conservatives and the Canadian Alliance, if they would partner up, form a coalition, Mr. Speaker, we can quash this thing and tell Ottawa Liberals where they can go. And I know people right here would like to tell Ottawa where they can go, Mr. Speaker. Yes, health, education, transportation are very, very important issues, Mr. Speaker. There's no question about it. But this is an important issue to rural Nova Scotia. It's very important. It's a big, big mess. It's a boondoggle. And all we're saying to Ottawa is, look, cut the funding. Every other day they're looking for $50 million here, $50 million there, and administration costs only. Sheila Fraser has no idea, the federal auditor general, what the enforcement costs are going to be of this federal piece of legislation. So, Mr. Speaker, obviously my colleagues, myself, and this government, and now I understand, I'm very pleased that the NDP has stayed around for this debate. You can't mention that a member isn't present in the House, or perhaps members, but what about a whole caucus, Mr. Speaker? You can't even say that, can you? No, so I won't say that. But, you know, it's really a shame that the Liberals haven't got enough interest to stand up for their constituents. They haven't got yes, let's give the floor to the Liberals. But thank you, Mr. Speaker. I really appreciate your indulgence.
Thank you, and call upon the honourable member for Hands East.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm not sure I can carry this debate with the passion that the honourable member from the beautiful Colchester Musquodoboit Valley did, but there are some points he made that I definitely agree with. That this is, even if you consider nothing else, you have to consider, is this a good way to spend taxpayers' dollars? And the concern for me is that when there are so many other more serious problems in this country, and I can think of healthcare and education as 1 and 2, that we would be putting the type of dollars that we're hearing now, which is going to be in the range of $1 billion and possibly $2 billion in another few years, that we shouldn't be taking that money and really putting it to use in a way that would really benefit the lives of Canadians. I think it's important for all of us to remember what was the reason for anybody approaching the federal government for this legislation. On December 6, 1989, 14 women were killed at the École de Polytechnique in Quebec. And although that violent act was committed by a madman with a weapon that would not be registered, it was an assault rifle, an illegal weapon anyway, that would not be registered under this registration plan. So therefore, anybody carrying one of those weapons again, it wouldn't be traced under this plan. That seems to be the ridiculousness of it all. But you have to think a little bit about the families who lost loved ones on that day and their need to come up with a solution or come up with something that means that those lives weren't taken in vain. That's something that Canadians have to think about. This is not the solution for that. As much as, I think even to lose a loved one, on the street by an accident, hit by an automobile, anything like that is tragic enough. But to have someone come and in a deliberate act of violence and take their life would be something that even I may be looking for some type of reason to say they didn't die in vain. So I can appreciate, I think, the fervor with which these families are looking for some measure for someone to account and try to ensure that this never happens again to anybody else in this country. We do not have a culture of guns like they do in the United States. And actually, we paid tribute yesterday to Mr. Donovan for his movie, Bowling for Columbine, which is a documentary based on that very subject. I don't believe that knowing that somebody breaking into my house has a registered weapon brings me any comfort. And And I want to say that, and certainly in the 40 years or so that we've been registering handguns, it really hasn't impacted on the use of those guns in terms of reducing the crimes with those guns. And in case of the registry of shotguns and rifles, which is my concern, actually, I would support the registration of handguns, but I can't support the registration of shotguns and rifles, or long guns, as some people refer to them, simply because I don't see any mechanism here that will reduce the number of deaths. And there's statistical evidence which indicates that violent crimes are on the decline in this country, not on the rise. I want people to think that it seems unfair to make people who are law-abiding bear the brunt of this cost, and that's what's going to happen. And I want members to know, I think as they should know, that I certainly have registered my shotguns and rifles, being an elected official, someone who sits in a House of Assembly with the knowledge of trying to support or pass legislation and pass laws in this House of Assembly. And even though I disagree with this one by the federal government, I think I have an obligation to register my weapons. The other day, the Minister of Natural Resources made a statement regarding the moose licenses and the moose hunt. And in his statement, it acknowledged that every year there are about 11,000 applications for moose licenses. Well, that would have to indicate that there are at least 11,000 people with long rifles, with rifles or shotguns, who want to go hunting. I'm assuming each one of them would pretty reasonable, pretty logical thought, I think. So, and if we assume that some of them would have two, or that there are a lot of people in this province who don't apply, they wouldn't be part of that 11,000. So we know we have 11,000 plus rifles or shotguns in this province. I asked my honourable colleague, the member for Halifax-Sherbucto, if he could tell me roughly how many homicides are committed in Nova Scotia in a year, and he wasn't sure, but he thought it was less than 100. And although I didn't have an opportunity to, or never occurred to me to research this prior, but I would be curious to know how many of those would be committed by hunting rifles or shotguns. So considering over 11,000 people with rifles, that somewhere less than 100 homicides, and certainly somewhere less than that, would be committed with shotguns and rifles. If the federal government was interested in actually attacking this problem, I think what they should do is look at what are the inherent causes of violent acts in society. We should be spending money, I think, to make the quality of life of people who are raised in situations which generates individuals who are violent offenders, to try to reduce those numbers or those impacts on people's lives so they can reduce the number of violent offenders. I think as well, there are those individuals in society that we already have been given a clue to a possible violent act. In other words, there's a peace bond issued against them, against their spouse or their mate or partner. And in these cases, for anyone that I think that we can identify, then to me that should be a reason for right of search and seizure to remove any weapons from that home. And also implicate, in other words, if that person goes to their brother-in-law or their brother or whoever, their cousin, and gets a weapon, that they're implicated as well in any violent act that this person commits. And I say that with very little legal background, in the sense that I'm not sure, under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, whether or not you're actually allowed to impose any act like that. I'm concerned about the right of the search and seizure part. I'm not sure whether you're able to do that in this country, or what changes it would take. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree, and if I say I don't necessarily agree with my honourable colleague across the floor, and in the case of Dr. Morton's assertion, and I'm going to say I certainly believe Dr. Morton is probably no slouch on this subject, but I think it might be a bit of a stretch to say that the right to security of person under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms has been violated if you can't, if you don't register your weapon. I think that all Canadians are entitled to self-defense. I think it's been an argument in the courts that has that stood the test of time, and it stands in the courts. And whether or not, I think if you were to defend yourself with a weapon that wasn't registered, I think the courts would probably, consider that fairly favorably. We don't want people hindered in their ability to secure themselves, and so I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. Forcing people to register their weapons takes away their right of security. But what I would be looking for, and I think my caucus colleagues, and I think the federal caucus as well, and actually when this bill came through the House of Commons, I think all members but one in the NDP caucus supported it originally, or voted against it, originally. There are good things in gun control, I have to say. I think locking your gun away, I think keeping your ammunition separate, I think these are all important initiatives, and I think that it was, but I don't see that registering of shotguns or rifles actually will address the problem of violence against anyone, and I'd like to see these dollars, if they're going to be used anywhere, they're used to put programs in place that help prevent violence. Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any other members wish to, the Honourable Minister of Justice.
I defer to the Liberal member, Mr. Speaker, if one of them wished to speak.
The Honourable Minister of Justice has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to make very few abbreviated comments, and I want to associate myself with a couple of things that my two colleagues on either side of the House said. One is the exorbitant cost of this program. Secondly, the fact that there was a lot better way to spend that money if we're interested in public safety. Secondly, I've received, as Minister of Justice and Attorney General here, petitions from a large number of people protesting against that act. And indeed, there's no questions. It's not an act that is acceptable in Nova Scotia. But one of the things I just want to make the point, Mr. Speaker, that people, as the Honourable Member from Hants East said, was talking about safe storage and appropriate use and training if you're going to use a long rifle. That is not part of the debate, is what they really object to. I mean, everybody says, well, if you're going to use something, it's like driving a car, you should be able to do it properly. I mean, people are not arguing about safety. But what they do resent very greatly is having to register a .22 or a shotgun or something like this, and if you're just can't make the case for public safety in that, as far as I can see, Mr. Speaker. And with those few comments, I'll sit down.
Mr. Minister. I'd like to thank the honourable members taking part in this debate this evening. We're adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow.